On that cloudy morning, everything seemed to be happening as it would on any other ordinary day. The sound of children running hurriedly along the sidewalks, the driver's whistle calling out the last students, and the engine of the old school bus vibrating gently as it waited for another group of students to board. Among them was Marcus Johnson, an 11-year-old boy with a watchful, silent gaze, known for being introspective and misunderstood by his peers. Nothing indicated that anything different would happen that day. However, within minutes, Marcus would make a decision that would completely change the fate of dozens of children, and no one would ever guess why. While everyone boarded normally, Marcus stood motionless on the sidewalk, his eyes fixed on the inside of the bus. It wasn't fear nor rebellion. It was as if something inside him was screaming, warning him that something was wrong. Despite the driver's and his fellow passengers' pleas, he refused to climb the steps. And what seemed like mere senseless stubbornness turned out to be a real premonition, a detail only he noticed that in moments would prevent a tragedy. Marcus's refusal caused boarding to be halted, forcing the adults to reassess the situation. What they discovered next shocked the entire town. But what exactly did Marcus see? How did he know something terrible was about to happen? And most shockingly, why did no one else notice the danger? This isn't just the story of a boy who followed his intuition. It's a profound lesson in quiet courage, overlooked sensitivity, and how a single child's attention can see what adults prefer to ignore. Prepare to be moved, chilled, and deeply reflect on everything that happens next. And if you believe that every life matters, that every voice should be heard, then like it now and subscribe to the channel. Because what you're about to watch today has the power to transform the way we view a child's silence. Marcus Johnson wasn't the kind of kid who drew attention. At 11, he walked the halls of Jefferson Middle School like a shadow few noticed. Short for his age, always with his backpack slung over one shoulder and his gaze lowered, he seemed determined to remain invisible. And, in a way, that's how the world treated him. As if his presence were irrelevant, as if what he said or perceived mattered nothing. He lived in a small wooden house in the less gentrified part of Springfield, next to his grandmother, who had raised him since childhood, and his mother, an exhausted nurse who spent more time at the hospital than at home. Marcus's routine was silent. He woke up early, helped his grandmother with her chores, walked to school, and spent his days trying not to be noticed. But behind this apparent silence, there was something no one understood. He had an unusual sensitivity, almost a sixth sense that allowed him to pick up on even the smallest details, an elusive glance, an out-of-place sound, a shadow where none should be. From an early age, Marcus had learned that talking about what he perceived was futile. At school, when he mentioned seeing something strange, the responses were laughter or reprimands. Among his classmates, he earned the reputation of being weird and scared. Among some teachers, however, he was just the absent-minded boy who made things up. The loneliness that arose from this didn't make him give up, but rather pushed him deeper into himself. Each time his words were discredited, his eyes became more alert, as if endlessly searching for proof that what he saw was real. In that neighborhood marked by inequality, Marcus also felt something he couldn't name, but it hurt. Slanted glances, veiled comments, the way adults sometimes treated him condescendingly as if his voice were worth less. Racism was present in the little things, in the way they always asked him to be the last to speak, or how some classmates never sat next to him on the bus. These moments taught him that to survive, he would need to observe more than speak. Despite this, Marcus found comfort in the small details of everyday life. He loved sitting on the porch with his grandmother, listening to old stories. He admired his mother's dedication, even though he knew her exhaustion hid silent tears. And above all, he harbored within him a flame of courage, albeit a quiet one. It wasn't the noisy courage of those who face the world with shouts, but the quiet courage of those who insist on standing firm, even when no one believes them. It was this invisible, discredited and sensitive boy who on that seemingly ordinary afternoon would stand between the lives and deaths of dozens of his classmates. A boy who until then had been just another face lost in the school crowd, but who possessed a rare gift, the ability to perceive what no one else saw. And it was precisely this skill that, amid the din of voices and the screeching of the bus brakes, awakened in Marcus the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. Because if for everyone else leaving school was just routine, for him there were signs that could not be ignored, signs that pointed to a danger that would soon become impossible to hide. The activity in the Jefferson Middle School courtyard was chaotic as usual at that time of day. Children jostled for the best seats on the bus. Some jostled each other laughing, others complained about the stifling afternoon heat. To anyone observing, nothing was out of the ordinary. But for Marcus, there was something off, an uncomfortable detail that throbbed in his mind like an invisible siren. He noticed the driver first. A man with a grim expression, a restless gaze, his hands trembling as he turned the car keys. Marcus had never seen him act like this. Normally the driver was serious, rigid, but predictable. That day, sweat was dripping down his forehead, even though the wind was cool. His eyes avoided direct contact, as if hiding a truth that could not be spoken. Then came the smell. It was a metallic, burnt odor, barely perceptible to others, but as clear to Marcus as the sound of an alarm. He approached the side of the bus and, in a quick gesture, crouched down. Between the glare of the sun and the shadow of the bodywork, he saw something that made him hold his breath. Loose, twisted wires, some cut unevenly, swaying slightly with each vibration of the engine. The boy felt his stomach churn. This wasn't right. Suddenly, a metallic clang echoed from inside the bus. His distracted colleagues ignored it, but Marcus instinctively flinched, his eyes fixed on the spot where the front wheels met the asphalt. The vehicle looked normal, but there were fresh marks on the bodywork, fine scratches, as if tools had been used hastily. He couldn't explain it, but he knew those marks carried a threat. His heart raced. He wanted to scream at that moment, but his voice failed him. Instead, he took a step back, swallowing hard, and let his teary eyes focus on the open bus door. Inside, dozens of his fellow passengers, already seated, laughed, chatted, and swung their legs, unaware of what was about to happen. For them, this was just the end of another ordinary day of classes. For Marcus, it was the beginning of something that could end in tragedy. The boy felt the same sensation he'd felt before, that suffocating feeling that something was about to explode. Only this time, it wasn't a snide comment or a nasty look in the school hallway. This time, it was bigger, more serious, more dangerous than anything he'd ever faced. He knew he had to act, but how? Who would believe him? How could he explain that it wasn't just loose wires, nor just a strange smell? How could he convince the adults who had so often called him an exaggeration? Panic was growing, but with it also arose an unexpected strength, a certainty that pushed him forward. Marcus had no other choice. Either he spoke now, even if he was ridiculed, or he would allow everyone to embark on something irreversible. And it was at that moment that he gathered what little courage he had and decided to face not only the disbelief of others, but also the shadow of danger that hung over that bus. Marcus took a deep breath, his eyes fixed on the open bus door. His body trembled, but not for lack of courage. What consumed him was the helplessness of knowing he had to prevent something terrible while simultaneously carrying the certainty that no one would believe him. Even so, he took two. steps forward, and positioned himself in front of the entrance, blocking the path of his classmates as they prepared to board. "Get out of the way, Marcus!" a blonde boy shouted, pushing him impatiently. But Marcus didn't leave. He stood firm, his arms outstretched, his breathing rapid. His classmates began to laugh, some making cruel comments, calling him cowardly and weird, as they always did. Others just huffed, irritated by the delay. To them, this was yet another pathetic scene of the boy. Trapped in his own silence, the driver, already nervous, leaned out the door, his brow furrowed. "Come on, boy, don't hold up the others. Get on up here or get out of the way." Marcus shook his head vigorously, tears streaming down his cheeks. His voice cracked at first, but soon burst into a desperate plea. "Don't get on. Please don't get on this bus." The silence lasted only a few seconds, broken by laughter and mocking glances. A girl whispered loudly, "He must be making it up again, as always." The school principal, Mrs. Parker, approached upon hearing the commotion. A woman with a rigid posture, accustomed to dealing with discipline, she crossed her arms in front of the scene. "Marcus, this is way out of line. What's going on?" The boy pointed down at the loose threads and the marks he'd noticed. His words came out in a rush, his sobs mingling with his sentences. "Something's wrong. The brakes. I saw it. I felt it. If we leave here, something bad will happen. Mrs. Parker sighed in exasperation. To her, it seemed like just another dramatic invention of an overly frightened boy. "Marcus, you're in the way. Get on the bus now or we'll be in trouble." The impatient children began to crowd behind him, some trying to push him inside. He resisted, clinging tightly to the doorframe, as if his life depended on it. His voice rose again, a cry filled with urgency. "I'm begging you. You have to believe me." The tone of his plea was no longer that of a sullen child. It was a genuine, desperate plea, almost a warning coming from the depths of fear. Some of his classmates paused for a moment, hesitant. Marcus's eyes shone with a mixture of tears and conviction that was beginning to unsettle even the most skeptical. The tension spread. Mrs. Parker, even though she was annoyed, sensed something different about his insistence. It was rare to see Marcus raise his voice, especially like that. There was pain. There was truth in every syllable. But before he could decide whether to give in, the driver slammed his hand on the steering wheel impatiently, trying to regain control of the situation. "This is absurd. This kid is going to make everyone miss their schedule." Marcus, however, didn't move. His small body felt like an insurmountable wall, held up by an invisible force. He knew that if he gave in now, everyone would pay the price. And it was in this atmosphere of tension and disbelief that the line between ridicule and heroism began to blur. Because, contrary to what everyone believed, Marcus's eyes didn't just see fear. They saw a hidden danger, a danger that only he dared to point out. The silence that fell after Marcus's shout didn't last long. His classmates began to grumble again. The driver huffed impatiently, and Mrs. Parker tried to maintain her authority. But a force grew within the boy that wouldn't let him back down. His eyes still watery, his breath labored, his heart racing. Everything in him screamed that he needed to prove what he'd seen. If no one believed his words, then he would have to prove it, even if it meant crawling on the ground to find evidence to support his intuition. Crouching down in front of the bus's front wheel, Marcus ignored the jeers coming from behind. The voices calling him crazy or playboy seemed distant, as if they didn't exist. His gaze took in every detail of the bodywork, every stain on the asphalt, every scratch on the metal, reflecting the last rays of sunlight. Suddenly, his fingers touched something cold and rough, deep scratch marks that looked like they'd been made by tools. The boy slid his hand carefully and found pieces of broken plastic wire, loose as if they'd been cut in a hurry. His stomach churned, and a wave of dread coursed through him. He stood up suddenly, clutching the wires in his palm, ran to Mrs. Parker and, weeping, begged a second time. His voice was cracking, but it carried a weight that couldn't be ignored. "Look, please, I'm not making this up. Someone tampered with this bus. Call the police, call whoever you need, but don't let us leave." The coordinator took a deep breath, torn between the urge to scold the boy and the nagging feeling that maybe, just maybe, there was truth in that desperate plea. Tension seemed to spread across the courtyard like a shadow. Some colleagues, previously mocking, exchanged nervous glances as if Marcus's tears were beginning to penetrate their barriers of disbelief. The driver, increasingly irritated, crossed his arms and looked away, trying to mask the unease burning his skin. Marcus, however, wouldn't back down. He knew he needed to go further. He hid the broken wires in his pocket and approached the bus again, leaning over to peer under the bodywork. His heart was pounding so loudly it seemed to echo inside his head, but he still stood his ground. What he saw made him hold his breath. Brake cables were partially loose, as if someone had tried to disguise a botched cut. It was the proof he needed, and even without understanding the mechanisms, he knew it shouldn't be that way. He ran back to Mrs. Parker, his voice firmer now, even through his sobs. "If I'm wrong, I'll accept any punishment, but if I'm right and you ignore it, it might be too late. Please don't let this bus leave." The gleam in the boy's eyes wasn't hysteria, but a conviction born of what he'd seen with his own eyes. The coordinator swallowed hard, gripped by a crushing dilemma. Reprimanding Marcus meant sticking to the routine and trusting the driver. Listening to him meant delaying everyone and exposing herself to ridicule in case she was just imagining it. The choice was before her, and time was running out. And it was in that moment of indecision that a subtle detail changed everything. A detail that would make Mrs. Parker hesitate for the first time in her life in front of a disbelieving student. Mrs. Parker stood still for a few seconds, holding her breath as if time had stopped. The cut wires were still in Marcus's pocket, but the conviction in her eyes was the true proof that began to shake his disbelief. For the first time, the woman couldn't find quick words to silence the boy. Something in his posture, in the way he refused to move from the front of the bus, made her hesitate, and that hesitation was enough for a decision to be made. In a hesitant voice, she asked all the students to wait, and, against her own logic, took out her cell phone to call the police. The driver reacted. Immediately, his face hardened, his brow furrowed, and he grumbled aggressively that this was a waste of time, that nothing was wrong, that Marcus was just trying to attract attention. But the coordinator, now torn between the authority of an adult and the desperate plea of a child, preferred to risk doubt rather than bear the blame. Some colleagues began to stir, murmuring among themselves, partly curious, partly frightened. The atmosphere of normalcy had been shattered. It wasn't long before 2 patrol cars arrived at the school gates. The sound of their muted sirens contrasted with the absolute silence that filled the schoolyard. 2 police officers approached the bus, spoke briefly with Mrs. Parker, and then one of them crouched down beside the vehicle. The serious look in his eyes and the way he ran his hand over the asphalt made everyone hold their breath. Within minutes, the inspection revealed the first anomaly. Brake system cables had indeed been tampered with. The officer stood up with a piece of loose wire in his hand and called his partner, who immediately opened the rear compartment. Tensions rose when, in the dim evening light, a metal device was found improvisedly attached to the bus's frame. It was small but dangerous, connected to cables that cut off the natural brake path. The shock was immediate. Mrs. Parker clapped her hands over her mouth, unable to contain her shock. Some students began to cry, others recoiled in fright, as if finally comprehending the scale of the tragedy they had almost experienced. The driver, for his part, went pale, his throat dry, his gaze lost, as if watching his version of the story shatter before everyone's eyes. Marcus watched silently, his heart racing. There was no satisfaction in his eyes, only a painful relief at having been heard in time. His intuition hadn't been a childish invention. It was the thin line between life and death for dozens of children. He knew this was only the beginning, that there were still unanswered questions. Who had done it? Why? What was the true purpose of the sabotage? The officers collected the pieces, photographed the cut cables, and asked everyone to step aside. Mrs. Parker, stunned, looked at Marcus with different eyes, as if she no longer saw the exaggerated boy, but someone capable of seeing what no one else could. The confirmation of the threat transformed each detail into something much larger, and the pieces began to fit together into a dark puzzle. And it was. At that moment, amid the chaos of discovery, that the driver's figure once again came to the fore. The sweat on his forehead wasn't just nervousness. It was a sign that there was much more to the sabotage, something yet to come to light. The weight of the revelation still hung in the air when the officers turned their attention to the driver. Until that moment, he had tried to mask his nervousness with scolding and harsh remarks. But faced with the evidence exposed, his expression cracked. His gaze oscillated between anger and fear, as if each breath were a failed attempt to maintain control. The officers took him aside to talk, and the man's rigid posture dissolved. At first, he tried to deny it, saying he knew nothing, that perhaps the vehicle had undergone poor maintenance, but his hands were shaking, and sweat was pouring down his face, revealing the pressure he was feeling. Then, when the officers persisted, his voice broke and his mask slipped. He wasn't just an innocent driver. He had been coerced by men linked to a small local gang, known for their brutality and the silence they imposed on anyone who dared to confront them. What was most terrifying wasn't just the veiled confession, but the way he spoke. Choppy words, detached sentences, eyes that avoided the police, as if he feared someone somewhere was listening. It was the fear of someone who knew that even if arrested, the consequences wouldn't end there. Marcus watched the scene from a distance, his chest tight. He who had so often been treated as invisible now saw the truth before everyone's eyes. The driver, a figure of authority until then, was now complicit in something much greater than simple irresponsibility. And as frightening as it was, that moment brought him a strange sensation. The fear he carried was no less than the fear etched on an adult's face. One of the officers approached Marcus, quietly thanking him for his insistence. But before he could feel any pride, the boy saw the driver give him an icy look. It was as if the man was silently holding him accountable for revealing what should have remained hidden. Marcus swallowed hard. That look said more than words could. "You've messed with something you don't understand." The boy didn't answer, but the courage that had always been born in silence gave him strength. Even small, even in disbelief, he kept his gaze fixed on the driver, unblinking, as if to say back, "I had no choice." It was a confrontation without shouting, without violence, just two locked gazes in a field of invisible tension. Around them, colleagues watched in shock, unable to fully comprehend the gravity of the situation. Mrs. Parker, overcome with emotion, didn't know whether to protect Marcus or try to hide her own guilt for not believing him at first. The police officers were leading the driver away, but the mystery was far from solved. Who had given the orders? Who had masterminded the sabotage? And what was the true intention behind putting so many children at risk? It was clear that Marcus had opened a door no one wanted to touch. The boy didn't have all the answers, but he knew that by stopping the bus from leaving, he had faced much more than disbelief. He had faced the hidden face of a danger that was only just beginning to be revealed. And as the driver was led away under the gaze of the crowd, the feeling that this was just the tip of something much bigger grew in the air, preparing everyone for the revelation. That would completely change the way this planned tragedy would be understood. The students' murmurs and the teachers' tense looks filled the courtyard like a heavy cloud. The driver had been removed, but the officers knew that wasn't enough. A sabotage of this magnitude was rarely an isolated incident, and every detail could reveal the extent of the plan. It was then that one of the officers, experienced in technical investigations, decided to calmly search every compartment of the vehicle. As onlookers gathered at a distance, he opened the side trunk of the bus, removed a small toolbox, and paused in front of a dark bag hidden among cables and hydraulic jacks. His expression changed instantly. Wearing gloves, he pulled out the bag and opened it in front of everyone. Inside were pliers, cutting knives, and strips of industrial-strength tape, instruments that made it clear none of this had been a coincidence. But the most disturbing detail was yet to come. In a quick analysis, the other officer found recent messages on the driver's cell phone that spoke of ensuring the trip didn't reach its destination and making it look like an unavoidable accident. The blunt, direct words were like hammer blows to the collective consciousness. It wasn't a mechanical failure, nor an unfortunate coincidence. It was a calculated plan to turn that bus into a moving tomb. Mrs. Parker clutched her chest, gasping for air, while the students closest to her began to cry. The weight of the revelation fell upon everyone like a suffocating wave. Marcus, standing a few steps back, watched silently. He didn't need to say anything, didn't need to shout, "I told you so." The truth spoke for itself, and each piece of evidence found confirmed what only his watchful eyes had perceived before it was too late. The atmosphere shifted. What had previously seemed merely a suspicion fueled by childhood fear now became a crime headline. The police cordoned off the bus, called in reinforcements, and began treating the case as criminal sabotage involving collective risk. From that point on, the afternoon's narrative was no longer about an exaggerated boy, but about how a potential tragedy had been averted by an intuition no one dared to comprehend. Even so, Marcus knew this was only a fragment of the story. The cut wires, the hidden tool, the messages found, everything pointed to something bigger than a simple, desperate act. He felt deep down that the public revelation was yet to come, and that the exposure of the crime would forever change not only his life, but also everyone's perception of who he was. The next morning, Springfield was no longer the same town. The sirens that had echoed the night before, the officers cordoning off the school grounds, and the bus surrounded by yellow tape quickly became news. Within hours, local channels were showing footage of Jefferson Middle School. Headlines splashed across the screens, and journalists jostled for space in front of the school's gates. What had previously seemed like just another ordinary afternoon of school was now being described as the tragedy averted, and the sabotage that could have cost dozens of lives. Parents rushed in, some in tears, hugging their children with a mixture of relief and dread. Teachers tried to organize the chaos, but even they couldn't hide their shock. For the first time, everyone understood the gravity of what Marcus had single-handedly discovered. The idea that an accident had been reported as a mechanical failure, masking a criminal plot, left the entire community stunned. Reporters questioned authorities, and details were gradually confirmed. Cut cables, improvised devices, evidence found on the driver's cell phone. Each revelation made the story darker. The word ambush began to recur in the news, and fear spread not only among the school students, but also among all the families who depended on school transportation in the region. Meanwhile, Marcus walked silently through the halls, trying to escape the curious gazes. He knew he wasn't officially mentioned in the reports, but inside the school, whispers were rife. Everyone already knew who had stopped the bus from leaving. Some classmates, who had previously mocked him, now watched him silently, as if carrying an invisible weight of regret. Others simply stared at him in astonishment, unable to comprehend how a boy who was never taken seriously had seen what no one else noticed. Mrs. Parker, still shaken, followed the boy's every step with a mixture of guilt and gratitude. Deep down, she recognized that if it weren't for her insistence, if it weren't for that moment when Marcus refused to give in, the tragedy would already be irreversibly written in the newspapers. Late that afternoon, when a local TV crew tried to enter the school, police blocked their entry. But a reporter managed to interview some parents outside, and the words echoed across all the news stations were uttered by a tearful mother. "If it weren't for that boy, we'd be burying our children today." From that moment on, the figure of the kid no one believed in began to take on the appearance of a hero, even though his name wasn't in the headlines. Marcus watched from afar, his heart heavy. There was no pride in his chest, but a strange mixture of relief and fear. He had saved his colleagues, but he knew his life would never be the same. The driver's gaze, filled with resentment and silent threat, was still etched in his mind. It was like a shadow reminding him that the story didn't end there. And as the sun set behind the school rooftops, Marcus realized that his previously discredited truth had become public. But what was still hidden, what no one had the courage to speak out loud, would only begin to surface when someone finally revealed the name behind the crime. The next morning, when Marcus walked through the school gates, something had changed irreversibly. The boy who had always gone, unnoticed, almost blending into the shadows of the hallways, now attracted glances wherever he went. They were no longer looks of mockery or indifference. There was a silent respect, a recognition mingled with disbelief. Some classmates who had previously called him scaredy looked away in shame. Others murmured among themselves as if his mere presence were enough to remind them of what they had witnessed. Mrs. Parker was the first to approach. Her usual firm, rigid posture had given way to an expression laden with emotion. With a choked voice, she leaned toward Marcus and said words he never imagined he would hear. "I'm sorry I didn't believe you. It was your courage that saved us all." The boy simply lowered his head shyly, muttering almost to himself that he just wanted no one to get hurt. He wasn't seeking applause, nor did he want to be the center of attention. All he wanted was silence, as he always had. But now silence carried a different weight, the weight of a hero. During recess, some classmates approached him with awkward gestures of gratitude. A girl left a folded note on his desk that read, "Thank you for saving us." A boy who usually laughed at his hesitations offered him his snack as a sign of respect. Marcus accepted each gesture humbly, but deep inside him was a discomfort he couldn't explain. Because being recognized as a hero didn't erase the years he'd been ignored, nor the moments his voice had been silenced. At the same time, the police and school administration chose not to publicly disclose Marcus's name. To the newspapers, he was simply an attentive student who noticed the signs of sabotage. This decision shielded him from undue attention and, in a sense, kept him safe from potential reprisals from those who had planned the ambush. But within the school community, the boy's identity was no secret. Marcus thus became an anonymous hero, revered in silence, admired discreetly, but still invisible to the outside world. And perhaps it was for the best. His gaze remained watchful, as if still waiting for something to happen again, as if he knew the story was not yet complete. Because behind the newspaper reports and the words of gratitude, a greater mystery remained. Who had ordered the sabotage? Why put so many children at risk? And most importantly, how far did the eyes that now invisible were perhaps watching Marcus's every move reach? What happened that morning at Jefferson Middle School went beyond the confines of an isolated incident or a simple news headline, revealing with painful brutality how society insists on ignoring, discrediting, or silencing the voices of children, especially when those voices come from black boys. Marcus Johnson, for many years, was that boy no one saw, whose presence went unnoticed in class, whose ideas were frequently interrupted, whose words were barely heard until the end. He was the kind of child labeled weird, too quiet, or even exaggerated, when in truth, his sensitivity simply didn't fit the harsh mold of collective indifference. And ironically, it was precisely he, the invisible one, who saw what no one else noticed, who felt what adults ignored, who placed himself, fearful and tearful, between danger and the lives of his classmates, transforming a silent refusal into an act of immeasurable courage. The community's reaction upon learning of what almost happened was filled with shock and shame, as it reflected a stark reality in which children like Marcus are constantly discredited before they can even complete a sentence, their instincts treated as nonsense and their concerns as childish drama. More than that, the case laid bare the suffocating weight of structural racism. If another boy with lighter skin from a better-known family had taken the same action, would he have been listened to more quickly, respected more seriously? This question, even without a direct answer, remained throbbing in everyone's subconscious, like an open wound that refused to heal. Marcus didn't seek applause. He didn't scream for attention. He didn't expect recognition. His strength lay in the firmness with which he stood where no one else would, in the silent conviction that something was wrong, even without concrete proof. His resistance, almost imperceptible, revealed the power of a courage that needs no stage to exist, for it manifests precisely when the conviction of a disbelieving child is enough to prevent a tragedy. And although the world turns its eyes to other stories, Marcus had already understood that his gaze, the same one that had been ignored for so long, now carried the responsibility to remain attentive, even when no one else was willing to listen. The bus remained parked, cordoned off by yellow tape, like a silent monument to all that could have happened. Around it, the city slowly returned to its normal routine, but the eyes of those who witnessed that day would never forget the weight of the tragedy. Averted, Marcus, sitting on the sidewalk in front of the school, watched the empty bus with an expression that mixed weariness and relief. For many, the story had ended there, with criminals investigated and an ambush disarmed. For him, however, there was something deeper, something that would not be erased so easily. The cold night wind blew across his face, ruffling his short hair as his mind replayed every moment of the previous afternoon. The memory of the laughter that mocked his courage still stung, but at the same time, it was impossible to ignore the certainty that his persistence had saved dozens of lives. The silence that had once been a burden now became a mark of strength. He didn't need headlines or applause because he knew, deep down, that he had played a role greater than himself. His grandmother, upon finding him home that night, held his hands firmly and said just one thing: "You were born to see what others cannot." These words resonated within Marcus, not as a compliment, but as a truth laden with responsibility. He understood that even in his smallness, he carried within himself a rare and dangerous gift: the sensitivity to perceive the invisible signs that could change entire destinies. Outside, the city murmured. Journalists still searched for answers. Parents commented in disbelief. Neighbors swapped stories about the boy who saved the bus. Marcus remained quiet, invisible in the conversations. But deep down, he knew his gesture would not be forgotten by those who had felt the weight of the threat so closely. Life would go on, new days would come, new stories would emerge, and perhaps collective memory would fade with time. But the truth remained. That afternoon, a shy and overlooked 11-year-old boy had become the connecting thread between tragedy and salvation. His quiet courage proved that greatness can be born from the most unlikely places, and that, often, the difference between living and dying lies in believing in what no one else sees. And if that afternoon in Springfield, destiny was rewritten by a disbelieving boy, the question remains: how many other stories still await discovery? How many secrets still lurk in the hallways, on the streets, in the places we think are safe? And above all, who will have the courage to listen when a small, seemingly powerless voice tries to warn us again? If you believe stories like Marcus's deserve to be told, if you also believe that silence can hide life-saving truths, subscribe to the channel now, because in the next episode, a simple notebook forgotten in a classroom will reveal secrets no one was prepared to face, and you won't want to miss this revelation.